Jasper Crane rode past the Lindqvist cabin every week from August to February, counting the woodpile that never appeared. He sat tall in his saddle each time, a man of 52 years who had built his fortune on the failures of others. 23 homesteads he had acquired in Carroll County alone, each one purchased from families who had run out of money, run out of hope, or run out of time. He knew the signs of defeat better than most men knew their own children's faces, and the Lindqvist girls showed every sign. "They're not cutting," he announced at Hendrick's General Store one September afternoon, warming his hands around a cup of coffee he hadn't paid for. "I ride past every Tuesday. No wood stacked, no logs split, nothing but two skinny girls pretending they know how to survive." Marcus Holloway, the carpenter, nodded from his seat by the pot-belly stove. "Saw the older one trying to repair their chicken coop last week. Used the wrong nails entirely. The whole thing will collapse by first frost." "Orphans," Margaret Dahl added, her voice carrying that particular mixture of pity and satisfaction that's small towns perfect over generations. "Both parents dead of cholera in Philadelphia. Grandmother drowned in the June floods trying to save her chickens. Those poor things have no one left in the world." Crane smiled. It was not a kind smile. "I'd give them until Christmas," he said. "Maybe January if we get a mild start to winter. Then they'll come to me, hats in hand, begging me to take the land off their hands." He set down his cup and moved toward the door. "I offered them $200 in June. By December I'll get it for $150. By January they'll give it to me for nothing just to escape." He rode past their cabin that very afternoon, slowing his horse to study the empty yard. No woodpile, no preparation. Just a weathered cabin with smoke trickling from its chimney and a golden-coated dog watching him from the porch with eyes that seemed to judge. The older girl, Elsbeth, appeared in the doorway. 23 years old, thin as a fence rail, with pale blonde hair pulled back from a face that revealed nothing. She met his gaze without flinching, without speaking, without any expression at all. Crane tipped his hat, more mockery than courtesy, and continued down the road. He did not see Elsbeth's hands hidden behind the doorframe. He did not see how they trembled. He did not see her younger sister Rosalind appear behind her, 16 years old with auburn hair and blue eyes swimming with tears. And he certainly did not see, as he rode away, congratulating himself on his patience, the fresh blisters on both girls' palms. The blisters they had earned digging in the darkness behind their cabin, night after night, while the rest of Carroll County slept. The funeral had been held in rain, June 19th, 1854. A date that Elsbeth would remember for the rest of her life, carved into her memory like letters on a headstone. She and Rosalind had stood beside the open grave while water poured from a sky the color of wet slate, soaking through their black dresses, plastering their hair to their skulls, mingling with the tears they could not stop. Grandmother Martha's coffin was simple pine. They could not afford better. The June floods had come without warning, turning the creek behind their property into a roaring monster that swept away the chicken coop, the garden fence, and the 71-year-old woman who had tried to save the only livestock the family had left. They found her body 3 days later, 2 miles downstream, tangled in the roots of a cottonwood tree. Only 3 people attended the burial. Elsbeth and Rosalind, of course, and old Astrid Magnusson from the neighboring property, a Swedish woman of 78 years, who walked with a cane carved from birch wood and spoke English with an accent thick as cream. Everyone else in Carroll County stayed home. "They're watching," Rosalind whispered as the preacher spoke words that the rain made impossible to hear. "From their windows, I can feel them watching." Elsbeth squeezed her sister's hand but said nothing. What was there to say? Their parents had died the previous spring in Philadelphia, victims of a cholera outbreak that swept through their neighborhood in 11 terrible days. Their father first, then their mother exactly 1 week later. The sisters had been sent west to live with their maternal grandmother, the only family they had left. Now grandmother was gone too. 3 funerals in 14 months. 3 times standing in rain or snow or bitter wind while someone they loved was lowered into the earth. 3 times watching dirt fall on wood and knowing that the world had become smaller, colder, emptier. After the preacher left and the grave diggers began their work, a figure appeared at the edge of the cemetery, Jasper Crane, his black coat flapping in the wind, his hat pulled low against the rain. "Miss Lindqvist," he called out, not bothering to approach through the mud. "A word when you have a moment." Elsbeth released her sister's hand and walked toward him, her boots squelching in the sodden grass. She stopped 6 feet away, close enough to hear him over the rain, far enough to keep her distance. "I understand this is a difficult time," Crane said, and his voice carried no understanding whatsoever. "But difficult times require practical thinking. You have 80 acres of land, a cabin in poor repair, no livestock worth mentioning, and no means of supporting yourselves." He paused, watching her face for any crack in its stillness. "I'm prepared to offer $200 for the property. Cash. Today. You can take a coach back east by week's end, find your family, start over somewhere that doesn't require you to survive on your own." Elspeth stood in the rain and said nothing. "It's more than fair," Crane continued. "The land is worth perhaps 300 in good times. But these aren't good times. Not for you. Not for anyone trying to make it alone out here." He smiled his cold smile. "Take the money, Miss Lindqvist. Take it while I'm still offering." Elspeth met his eyes. Gray eyes, pale as winter sky, that seemed to look through him rather than at him. "No," she said. Then she turned and walked back to her sister. Crane watched her go, and his smile did not waver. He had heard that word before. He had heard it from dozens of desperate homesteaders who thought they could hold out against weather and circumstance and the simple mathematics of survival. They always said no at first. They always said no, right up until the moment they said yes. He rode away, certain that winter would do his negotiating for him. The cabin was cold that night. Not cold from temperature, not yet, though June had turned bitter after the floods. Cold from emptiness. Cold from the absence of Grandmother Martha's humming as she cooked. Cold from the silence where her voice should have been, telling stories of the old country, of Sweden, of the winters that taught her people how to survive when survival seemed impossible. Rosalind sat at the small table, staring at a candle flame that flickered in drafts they could not find or fix. Elsbeth stood at the window, watching darkness claim the land that was now entirely their responsibility. Copper, the 4-year-old hunting dog that had been Grandmother Martha's constant companion, lay on the floor between them. He had not eaten in 2 days. He kept going to the door and whining, as if expecting his mistress to walk through it at any moment. "We should sell," Rosalind said finally. Her voice was hoarse from crying. "Not to Crane. Never to Crane. But to someone. Anyone." Elsbeth did not turn from the window. "We have no money," Rosalind continued. "Grandmother's savings won't last until August. We can't harvest the crops ourselves. We can't cut enough wood for winter. We can't fix the roof or the fence or the chicken coop that isn't there anymore." Her voice broke. "Elsbeth, we're going to die here." "No," Elsbeth said, just as she had said to Crane, just as she had been saying, in one form or another, since their parents' graves were filled in Philadelphia. "How?" Rosalind demanded. "How are we going to survive? We're 2 girls alone in a place where grown men with families fail every single year." Crane isn't wrong about that. People die out here. They freeze, they starve. They give up and walk into blizzards and are found in spring with peaceful expressions on their faces because death finally freed them from trying. Elsbeth turned from the window. In the candlelight, her face looked older than 23. Older than any face had a right to look. "I made a promise," she said. "When Mother was dying, I held her hand and promised I would take care of you. When Father was dying, I promised him I would never let strangers decide our fate. When Grandmother was alive, I promised her I would keep this land in the family." She crossed to the table and sat down across from her sister. "I have made too many promises to the dead to break them now," she said. "So we will not sell. We will not run. We will find a way." "What way?" Rosalind asked. Elsbeth had no answer. The knock came at midnight. Copper heard it first, lifting his head from his paws, ears pricked toward the door. Then the knock came again, gentle but insistent, and Elsbeth was out of bed with the rifle before Rosalind had fully awakened. "Who's there?" Elsbeth called through the door, the gun raised and ready. "Astrid Magnusson," came the reply. "Your neighbor, the old Swedish woman who was at the funeral." Elsbeth glanced at Rosalind, who had risen from her pallet in the corner, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. Something passed between the sisters, a silent communication born of shared tragedy. And then Elsbeth lowered the rifle and opened the door. Astrid Magnusson stood on the porch, her cane in one hand and a basket covered with cloth in the other. She was small and bent, white-haired and wrinkled, but her blue eyes held a sharpness that age had not dimmed. "I brought bread," she said, "and a question." Elsbeth stepped aside to let her enter. Copper rose and approached the old woman, sniffing her skirt, then wagging his tail as if recognizing a friend. Astrid set her basket on the table and looked around the cabin with an appraising eye. The gaps in the walls, the sagging shelf above the stove, the empty pegs where winter coats should hang. She saw everything, and her expression suggested she found it wanting. "So," she said, settling into a chair as if she owned it, "you are going to try to survive the winter alone?" "Yes," Elsbeth said, "with no wood. We'll cut wood. 2 girls. You'll cut perhaps 3 cords before the first snow. Maybe 4 if you work yourselves to exhaustion." Astrid shook her head. "You need 25 cords minimum to heat this cabin through an Iowa winter. 25 cords that you cannot cut, cannot buy, and cannot borrow." Rosalind sank into a chair, her face pale. But Elsbeth remained standing, arms crossed, chin lifted. "Then we'll find another way," she said. Astrid smiled. It was a strange smile, knowing and sad and triumphant all at once. "Yes," she said, "you will, because I am going to teach you." She reached into her basket and withdrew the bread, still warm, along with a jar of honey and a small wheel of cheese. She set these things on the table as if they were offerings or perhaps payment for what was to come. "My husband Gunnar died in 1834, she said, 20 years ago this past spring. We had been in America only 7 years. We had a cabin much like this one, land much like yours, and neighbors much like the ones who watched your grandmother buried without offering a hand." She broke off a piece of bread and ate it slowly. "I survived, alone, for 20 years. Through winters that would have killed anyone who relied on what the Americans think they know about winter." She fixed Elsbeth with her sharp blue gaze. "Do you know how I survived?" Elsbeth shook her head. "I survived because my grandmother in Småland, in Sweden, taught me things that people here have forgotten, or never knew." Astrid leaned forward. "Tell me, child, where are you going to store your wood?" Elsbeth frowned. "Outside, by the cabin. Where else would we store it?" Astrid laughed. It was not a mocking laugh, but there was something in it that suggested Elsbeth had just proven a point. "In Sweden," the old woman said, "we stored wood underground, in cellars, in pits, in chambers dug into the earth, where the temperature never falls below freezing and the rain never reaches." She stood, leaning on her cane, and gestured toward the door. "Come, I want to show you something." Rosalind and Elsbeth exchanged another glance. Then they pulled on their boots and followed the old woman into the night. The walk to Astrid's cabin took 15 minutes through darkness and dew-wet grass. Copper trotted alongside them, alert and curious, as if sensing that something important was happening. Astrid's property was tidier than the Lindqvist claim. Her cabin stood solid and well-maintained, with a proper garden and a sturdy fence, and chickens sleeping in a coop that looked like it could withstand a hurricane. But what caught Elspeth's attention was what she did not see. No woodpile, no logs stacked against the cabin wall, no cords of split timber arranged in the yard, no visible fuel at all. "Where is your wood?" Elspeth asked. Astrid smiled again and led them around the cabin to a patch of grass that looked like every other patch of grass. She knelt, her old bones creaking, and pulled aside a layer of dried vegetation to reveal a wooden door set into the ground. "Here," she said. She lifted the door to reveal a tunnel sloping down into darkness, lined with flat stones, wide enough for a person to walk upright. Cool air drifted up from below, carrying a scent of earth and dry wood. Astrid took a lantern from a hook just inside the entrance and lit it with matches from her pocket. Then she began to descend, her cane tapping on the stones with each step. Elsbeth and Rosalind followed. The tunnel went down at a gentle angle for perhaps 20 feet, then opened into a chamber that made both sisters stop and stare. Wood. More wood than Elspeth had ever seen in one place, stacked in rows that reached toward the ceiling, cord after cord of logs and split timber, arranged with military precision on wooden platforms that kept them off the earthen floor. Elsbeth counted without thinking. 40 cords, perhaps 45, enough to heat a cabin for 4 winters. 5 if you were careful. This is impossible, Rosalind breathed. It is simple, Astrid replied. The earth maintains a constant temperature below the frost line. 52 degrees, summer and winter, year after year. Wood stored here never gets wet, never freezes, never rots. She walked along the rows, running her hand over logs that were perfectly seasoned, ready to burn. I have been adding to this cellar for 20 years. Every summer I cut wood and drag it down here. Every winter I burn what I need and no more. The wood waits for me, and I never run short. Elsbeth reached out and touched a log. Dry, perfectly dry. Not a trace of the dampness that plagued every woodpile she had ever seen. Above ground, wood gets wet, Astrid continued. Rain, snow, ice. Wet wood burns poorly, gives less heat, makes more smoke. You use twice as much to stay half as warm. She turned to face the sisters, her lantern casting dancing shadows on the earthen walls. Underground, the wood stays dry, always dry, and it is here, beside your cabin, so you do not have to carry it through snowdrifts when the blizzard comes. Rosalind had tears in her eyes again, but these were different tears. You're saying we could do this, she said. We could build this. I am saying you must do this, if you want to survive. Elsbeth's mind was already racing, calculating dimensions and volumes and the hours of labor required. How long did this take to build? The digging took 1 summer. I was younger then, stronger, but still only one woman working alone. You are 2. Astrid began walking back toward the tunnel entrance. You have 4 months until winter. It is enough. It must be enough. They climbed back to the surface into air that suddenly felt warm and alive after the cool stillness of the cellar. Astrid sealed the door again and covered it with dried grass, and within moments there was no sign that anything unusual lay beneath. Come back tomorrow, the old woman said. I will teach you everything my grandmother taught me. The dimensions, the ventilation, the drainage, everything. She began walking back toward the Lindqvist cabin, slower now, leaning more heavily on her cane. But you must tell no one. The people here will not understand. They will call you foolish. They will call you crazy. They will say it cannot work because they have never seen it done. What do we do when they say those things? Rosalind asked. Astrid smiled her knowing smile. You say nothing. You show them nothing. You let them believe what they believe. She stopped walking and turned to face both sisters, her eyes bright in the moonlight. And when winter comes, when they are burning wet wood and freezing in their cabins, when they have used all their fuel by January and are breaking up furniture to stay alive, you will be warm. You will be safe. You will have proven them wrong without saying a single word. Elsbeth nodded slowly. She understood. She understood perfectly. And when they come to you, Astrid continued, and they will come eventually, when they see you survived what should have killed you, when they ask how you did it, you will decide. You will decide whether to share what you know or keep it to yourself. That is the choice that will show you who you really are. She began walking again, her cane tapping a steady rhythm on the dark earth. I have been waiting 20 years for someone to teach, she said. I thought perhaps I would die without passing on what my grandmother gave me. But then I saw you at the funeral. I saw how you stood, how you looked at Crane, how you refused to break. She stopped at the edge of the Lindqvist property and turned one last time. I think perhaps you are the ones. I think perhaps you are ready to learn what survival really means. Then she walked away into the darkness, leaving Elspeth and Rosalind standing alone with a dog and a decision and 4 months to do the impossible. 2 orphan girls against an entire town that wanted them to fail. A hole in the ground that no one would believe could save them. And a winter coming that would test everything they thought they knew about survival. If you think you know how this ends, stay with me. Because what Elsbeth and Rosalind built in the darkness would change not just their lives, but the lives of everyone who had laughed at them. The excavation began the following night. Elsbeth had spent the day at Astrid's cabin learning. She learned about dimensions. 22 feet long, 12 feet wide, 8 feet deep. She learned about the tunnel, sloping down at 15 degrees, lined with flat stones from the creek, wide enough to drag a sledge of logs through. She learned about ventilation, a shaft on the far side of the chamber, rising to the surface, covered with a wooden cap that kept rain out, but let air circulate. She learned about the mathematics of survival, 340 cubic feet of earth to move, 127 pounds per cubic foot of Iowa clay, 43,000 pounds total, 21 and a half tons. Two girls with shovels working 6 hours a night could move perhaps 1 ton per week. They needed 21 weeks. They had 18. It's not enough time, Rosalind said when Elsbeth explained the numbers. Then we work faster. They began at 8 o'clock that first night, after the last light faded from the western sky and the windows of distant cabins went dark. Elsbeth chose a spot behind their cabin, sheltered from view by a small rise in the land, invisible from the road that Jasper Crane rode every Tuesday. The first shovel bit into earth that was still soft from the June floods. Copper sat nearby and watched, his head tilted as if puzzling over what these humans were doing. They dug until 2 in the morning. Then they covered their work with branches and dried grass, crawled back to the cabin, and slept until dawn. The next day they walked through town. Not because they needed anything, but because Elsbeth understood that they needed to be seen. If they disappeared completely, people would grow curious. If they appeared weak and exhausted and defeated, people would assume the obvious. So they walked slowly, spoke softly, and let Margaret Dahl draw her own conclusions. "Poor things," the woman said to her husband that evening. "They look half dead already. They won't last a month." The pattern established itself over the following weeks. Night became their day. Darkness became their ally. While Carroll County slept, Elsbeth and Rosalind transformed themselves from grieving orphans to something else entirely. They became workers, soldiers, survivors. The clay fought them. It was heavy and dense and stubborn, clinging to their shovels, filling their boots, coating their skin until they looked like creatures made of earth. Elsbeth's hands blistered and bled and calloused over, then blistered again. Rosalind's back ached so badly some nights that she could not straighten fully until she had been working for an hour. But the hole grew. By the end of July, they had excavated 4 feet down across the entire planned area. By mid-August, they had reached 6 feet. The walls began to take shape, and Elsbeth started reinforcing them with timber salvaged from trees that had fallen during the floods. Astrid visited every few days, always at night, always with food or advice or both. She showed them how to create the sloped entrance, how to line it with stones that would channel water away rather than into the chamber. She taught them about the ventilation shaft, about the wooden platforms that would keep the wood off the earthen floor, about the door that would seal the entrance against snow and wind. "Your grandmother's grandmother," Rosalind asked one night as they rested in the half-finished chamber. "She taught you all this?" "In Smolin, winter can kill you in an hour," Astrid replied. "We learned to survive before we learned to walk. Every child knew how to store food, store wood, store heat. It was not special knowledge. It was just knowledge, the kind that keeps you alive." "Why doesn't anyone here know it?" Astrid was quiet for a moment, her wrinkled face thoughtful in the lantern light. "Because they think they know better," she said finally. "They came from places with milder winters, or they learned from fathers who never saw a true killing cold. They stack their wood outside because that is what they have always done. They build their fires big because bigger seems better. They do not think about why, only about what." She smiled her sad, knowing smile. "And so they use twice the wood to stay half as warm, and when the blizzard comes, they run out and they die, and the next generation does exactly the same thing." She pushed herself to her feet, leaning on her cane. "You are different. You do not have the luxury of assumptions. You must think about why, or you will not survive to make the same mistakes." August bled into September. Jasper Crane continued his weekly rides, and each time he passed the Linkovist cabin, he slowed his horse to study the yard. No woodpile, no logs, no visible preparation of any kind. He mentioned this at Hendrick's store, where men gathered to drink coffee and discuss the failures of others. "Still nothing," he reported. "Not a single cord. Either they're planning to burn furniture, or they've given up completely. Marcus Holloway shook his head. I told them 6 weeks ago that their chicken coop would collapse. It did. I offered to help repair it for a fair price. The older one just stared at me and said nothing. He sipped his coffee. Strange girl. Cold. Like she doesn't feel anything at all. She'll feel the cold soon enough, Crane said. First hard frost will remind her that pride doesn't heat a cabin. They laughed, the comfortable laughter of men who believed they understood the world. What they did not see was happening at night. The chamber was nearly complete now, 8 feet deep with walls reinforced by 48 oak timbers, each 8 inches in diameter. The entrance tunnel sloped down at the perfect angle, lined with 200 flat stones that Elsbeth and Rosalind had carried one by one from the creek, each stone weighing 15 to 20 pounds. The ventilation shaft rose on the far side, covered with a wooden cap that could be adjusted to control airflow. Eric Magnuson, Astrid's 46-year-old son, had begun helping on weekends. He was a carpenter by trade, quiet and skilled, and he asked no questions about why 2 young women were building an underground chamber. He simply worked beside them, teaching them how to fit joints and seal gaps and create a structure that would stand for decades. Mother says you're the first people she's taught since we came to America, he said one night, fitting a crossbeam into place. Why us? Rosalind asked. Eric shrugged, driving a wooden peg into the joint. She says you have the look of people who will do whatever it takes. The wood began arriving in September. 3 cords that Elsbeth cut herself from trees the June floods had toppled. 8 cords that she and Rosalind earned by helping neighbors with their harvest, working dawn to dusk in fields while hiding the blisters that might have revealed their nighttime labors. 10 cords purchased at $3 each from a man whose wife was sick and needed money for medicine. Elsbeth used every cent of Grandmother Martha's savings for those 10 cords. Rosalind argued against it, saying they needed seed money for spring, but Elsbeth had done the calculations. Without wood, there would be no spring. They would not survive long enough to plant anything. 12 more cords came from the forest, dead fallen dry branches and fallen limbs that the sisters gathered every afternoon before their nighttime digging. It was exhausting work, dragging wood through underbrush, but each piece represented heat. Each piece represented life. By the first week of October, they had 33 cords stacked in the underground chamber, arranged on wooden platforms in rows that reached nearly to the ceiling, perfectly seasoned and waiting. The chamber was sealed with a door of 4-inch oak, fitted tight and insulated with straw. From outside, there was nothing to see. No woodpile, no logs, no indication that they had any fuel at all. Just a cabin with a thin trail of smoke rising from the chimney and 2 orphan girls who were supposed to be freezing. The skeptics came in waves. First was Marcus Holloway in late September, walking up to the cabin with the expression of a man delivering bad news he was secretly pleased to deliver. Ladies, he said, not removing his hat, I've been noticing you have no wood stored for winter. Elspeth was outside carrying water from the well. She set down her buckets and looked up at him, her pale gray eyes revealing nothing. Is that so? Everyone in the county has noticed. We're worried about you. His face arranged itself into concern that did not reach his eyes. I've been building structures in this county for 20 years. I know what it takes to survive a winter here. And I'm telling you, you're not going to make it without at least 20 cords stacked and ready. Thank you for your concern. Concern? His voice sharpened. I'm trying to save your lives, girl. Underground storage? Is that what the old Swedish woman is telling you? I've heard the rumors. I'm telling you now, it won't work. The whole thing will flood and rot. You'll open that cellar in December and find nothing but mold and waste. Elsbeth picked up her buckets. You will see, she said. Then she walked inside. Next came Reverend Ezekiel Whitmore, appearing on a Sunday afternoon with his Bible tucked under his arm and his face arranged in pastoral concern. I've come to pray with you, he announced when Rosalind opened the door, and to offer counsel. They let him in because refusing a minister seemed unwise. He sat in the best chair, the one that had been Grandmother Martha's, and looked around the cabin with the air of someone cataloging sins. I've heard about your project, he said. The digging, the underground chamber. He opened his Bible, though he did not read from it. I must warn you about placing too much faith in pagan methods. The Swedish ways may have worked in the old country, but this is America. This is a Christian land. God provides for those who trust in him, not for those who dig holes in the earth like heathens. Rosalind felt her face flush with anger, but Elspeth's hand on her shoulder kept her silent. Our grandmother was Lutheran, Reverend, Elspeth said calmly, just as you are. She taught us that God helps those who help themselves. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. Your grandmother drowned trying to save chickens. Perhaps there is a lesson in that. The silence that followed was cold enough to freeze water. Thank you for visiting, Elspeth said. I believe we've heard enough counsel for today. She showed him to the door. She did not invite him back. Then came Margaret Dahl, who did not visit in person, but whose words traveled through the county faster than wind. They're digging their own graves, she told everyone who would listen. I've seen the younger one covered in dirt, her hands bleeding. Poor thing doesn't know she's preparing her own burial. And then came Josiah Tanner, 19 years old, loud and foolish, and looking for entertainment. He arrived with 3 friends on an October evening, all of them stinking of whiskey, and stood in the yard shouting until Elspeth emerged. We're here to bet, he announced, swaying slightly. $5 says you're gone by Thanksgiving. 10 says you're dead by Christmas. Who wants in? His friends laughed. Elspeth said nothing. What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or are you too stupid to understand? Still nothing. Josiah's smile faltered. Something about her silence was worse than any response would have been. She just stood there watching him with those gray eyes, waiting for him to finish. You'll see, he said finally, trying to recover his bravado. When you're freezing, when you're begging for help, we'll remember this. We'll remember how proud you were. Elspeth's voice was quiet but clear. Yes, you will remember. Then she went back inside and closed the door. The next morning, someone had painted words on the side of their chicken coop. Fresh paint, still wet, spelling out a message that made Rosalind's hands shake when she saw it. Dig your own graves, orphans. Elspeth looked at the words for a long moment. Then she walked to the barn, found a bucket and brush, and began scrubbing. Aren't you angry? Rosalind demanded. Yes. Then why don't we tell them? Why don't we show them what we've built? Why don't we prove them wrong? Elspeth stopped scrubbing and turned to face her sister. Because proving them wrong now would feel good for a moment. Proving them wrong in February will last forever. She resumed her work. Let them laugh. Let them mock. Let them believe whatever makes them happy. When the snow comes, they will see. And when they see, they will understand that their laughter meant nothing. She finished scrubbing and stood back to examine the clean wood. Grandmother used to say that the best revenge is living well, but I think the best revenge is living at all when everyone expected you to die. The accident came on a Wednesday, September 23, 1854, 3 weeks before the first frost. Elspeth was working alone in the chamber, shoring up a section of wall that had started to crumble, while Rosalind slept in the cabin above. The shovel slipped. It was a simple accident, the kind that happens when exhaustion combines with darkness and haste. The shovel blade struck a rock, bounced upward, and drove directly into Elspeth's left calf. She felt it more than saw it, a cold shock followed by spreading warmth that she knew was blood. She tried to stand. Her leg buckled. Copper appeared at the tunnel entrance, barking furiously, and within minutes Rosalind was there, her face white with terror. How bad? Elspeth asked, though she could see the answer in her sister's eyes. The wound was 2 inches deep, bleeding freely, carved into the muscle with enough force to make walking impossible. Rosalind ran for Astrid while Elspeth sat in the chamber, surrounded by stacked wood, pressing her skirt against the wound and wondering if everything they had built would end here. Astrid came with her son and her knowledge. Infection, she said after examining the wound by lantern light. This is what kills more than the injury itself. We must clean it, pack it, keep her still. For how long? A week, perhaps longer. Rosalind felt the ground shifting beneath her. A week. They had been working together, barely keeping pace with the calendar. Now she would be alone. I'll do it, she said. I'll finish the work alone. Astrid looked at her sharply. You are 16 years old. I'm 16 years old and I have no other choice. Elspeth was carried back to the cabin, delirious with pain by the time they laid her on the bed. The fever came that night, spiking high enough to make her talk to people who were not there. She called for her mother. She called for her father. She called for grandmother Martha in a voice that broke Rosalind's heart. Copper refused to leave her side. He lay on the floor next to the bed, his golden head on his paws, his eyes never leaving Elsbeth's face. He did not eat. He did not go outside. He simply watched and waited, as if his attention alone could keep her alive. Rosalind dug. Every night from dusk until past midnight, she descended into the chamber and continued the work. Her hands bled. Her back screamed. Her eyes burned with tears she did not have time to shed. She talked to herself as she worked, keeping herself company in the underground darkness. This is for Elsbeth. This is for mother and father. This is for grandmother Martha, who died saving chickens because chickens were all we had left. She talked to Copper when the dog came down to check on her, his tail wagging uncertainly. Good boy, good dog. We're going to make it. We're all going to make it. She wrote in her journal by candlelight after each night's work, her handwriting cramped and desperate. My hands bleed. My back screams. But I will not let them win. I will not let Elsbeth die. I will not let Crane take our land. On the fourth day, Elsbeth's fever broke. She opened her eyes to find Copper staring at her from 6 inches away, his tail thumping the floor with joy. Rosalind was asleep in a chair beside the bed, still dressed for digging, her face streaked with dried clay. Elsbeth tried to sit up. The pain stopped her. Don't, Rosalind said, waking instantly. Astrid said you need at least 3 more days. The chamber. Almost finished. Another foot to dig, then the ventilation shaft. Rosalind's voice was hoarse with exhaustion. I've been doing it alone. Elsbeth reached out and took her sister's hand. I'm sorry, she whispered. Don't be sorry, just get better. Copper licked Elsbeth's face, then jumped off the bed and trotted toward the door. He paused at the threshold and looked back, his tail wagging, as if saying, Come on, there's work to do. Rosalind laughed through her tears. Even the dog knows, she said. Even the dog knows we're not done yet. Jasper Crane began to grow suspicious in mid-October. The Lindqvist girls should have been deteriorating. They should have been gaunt, exhausted, broken by the impossible task of surviving without preparation. Instead, they looked healthy. Tired, certainly, but healthy. Strong, even. The older one was limping slightly, but she was walking, working, living. He hired a man to watch them during the day. The report came back unremarkable. The sisters did light chores, carried water, tended a small garden. Nothing unusual, nothing that explained how they seemed to be thriving when they should be dying. Crane decided to take matters into his own hands. The wood in Carroll County was controlled by 3 suppliers. Crane visited each of them in turn, making offers they could not refuse. By the end of October, every cord of firewood in the county was either owned by Crane or promised to someone who had already paid. If those girls want wood, he told his associates, they'll have to come to me, and my price will be the land itself. He rode past the cabin on the last Tuesday of October, looking for signs of panic. There were none. The older girl was outside splitting wood that seemed to come from nowhere. The younger one was hanging laundry as if winter were months away instead of weeks. They did not look at him as he passed. They did not look at him at all. The first snow fell on November 8th. It was light, barely an inch, but it announced winter's arrival with a cold clarity that made even the hardiest farmers check their supplies. Chimney smoke thickened across Carroll County as families fired up stoves and assessed their woodpiles. The Lindqvist cabin smoked thinly, steadily, like a cabin with nothing to worry about. Crane watched from the road and could not understand. Temperance Garrett, the 14-year-old daughter of a neighboring farmer, came to visit on November 15th. She was a curious girl, too curious for her own good, and she had been watching the Lindqvist sisters all autumn with fascination. My father says you're going to freeze, she announced as she stood in their doorway. Does he? Elsbeth said. He says everyone thinks so. He says you have no wood. Elsbeth glanced at Rosalind, then back at the girl. Would you like to see something, Temperance? The girl's eyes widened. Yes. You must promise not to tell anyone. Not your father, not your mother, not anyone. Can you keep a secret? Temperance nodded eagerly. Elsbeth led her around the cabin, to the hidden door covered with dried grass. She pulled it aside and revealed the tunnel entrance. Follow me. They descended into the earth, into the cool, still air of the chamber. Temperance's gasp echoed off the wooden walls as she saw what waited below. 33 cords of well-seasoned firewood, stacked in rows that reached toward the ceiling. Enough to heat a cabin for 2 winters, more than enough to prove everyone wrong. "How?" the girl whispered. "We dug it, all summer, every night, while everyone thought we were failing." Temperance turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. When she looked back at Elspeth, her eyes were shining. "This is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. Remember your promise. No one can know." "I'll remember." She paused. "But why? Why not show everyone? Why not prove them wrong?" Elspeth smiled, the first real smile she had allowed herself in months. "Because proving them wrong in November is worth nothing. Proving them wrong in February, when they've run out of wood and we're still warm, is worth everything." The girl nodded slowly, understanding. "I want to learn," she said. "When you're ready to teach, I want to learn how to do this. Maybe someday." "Promise?" Elspeth looked at this girl who had risked her father's anger to visit orphans everyone thought were doomed. She saw something familiar in those young eyes, something she recognized. "I promise," she said. The cold deepened in November, then deepened again. The cabin Lindqvist stayed warm. The skeptics stayed confused. The woodpile never appeared in the yard. An underground 33 cords of perfectly dry firewood waited for the worst winter in Iowa's history. On November 28th, Astrid Magnusson collapsed in her garden. Eric found her face down among the winter squash, her cane broken beneath her breathing shallow and irregular. He carried her inside and sent word to Elspeth immediately. By the time the sisters arrived, Astrid was conscious but changed. Something had gone out of her eyes. Something had let go inside. "I will not see spring," she said without preamble. "I have known for some time. The body knows when the body is done." "Don't say that," Rosalind whispered. "I say what is true. I have always said what is true." Astrid reached beneath her pillow and withdrew a leather journal, worn and stained with age. "This belonged to my grandmother, and her grandmother before her. 4 generations of women in Smolin, writing down what they learned about survival." She pressed the journal into Elspeth's hands. "I have no daughters. I thought perhaps I would die without passing this on. Then I saw you at the funeral. I saw how you stood, how you refused to break." Her voice grew weaker with each sentence. "You are my daughters now. This is your inheritance." Elspeth opened the journal carefully. The pages were filled with drawings and diagrams and dense Swedish text, illustrated with careful sketches of root cellars and food storage and heating systems and dozens of other survival techniques. "I don't read Swedish," she said. "You will learn, or you will find someone to translate." Astrid closed her eyes. "The important thing is that it survives. Knowledge survives. That is how we defeat the cold. Not by fighting it, by outliving it, by passing on what we know to those who come after." She was quiet for a moment, breathing slowly. "I have been alone for 20 years, she said finally. "I have survived. But survival means nothing if you survive alone. Remember that when the storm comes. Remember what you have built is not just for you." She died 3 days later, peacefully in the night, with her son by her side and a smile on her weathered face. They buried her next to her husband in the small plot behind her cabin, the ground already frozen hard enough to make digging difficult. Only Elspeth, Rosalind, Eric, and Temperance Garrett attended the funeral. The rest of Carroll County was too busy preparing for winter to honor an old Swedish woman who had kept to herself for 20 years. Crane had bought every cord of wood in the county. The town had mocked them for 6 months. Their mentor was dead, and the worst blizzard in Iowa history was about to arrive. If you think 2 orphan girls with a hole in the ground cannot possibly survive what comes next, stay with me. Because the man who counted their empty woodpile is about to learn a lesson he will never forget. The blizzard announced itself on December 23rd at 7 minutes past 2 in the afternoon. Elspeth was outside feeding the chickens when she felt the temperature drop. Not gradually, as it had been dropping for weeks, but suddenly, as if someone had opened a door between Iowa and the Arctic and forgotten to close it. She looked west. The sky had turned a color she had never seen before. Yellow-green, like an old bruise stretching from horizon to horizon. The clouds were not moving like normal clouds. They were boiling, churning, advancing like an army. She dropped the feed bucket and ran. "Rosalind! Now! Everything inside now!" Her sister appeared at the cabin door, saw Elspeth's face, saw the sky, and understood immediately. They had perhaps 30 minutes, perhaps less. The chickens went into the cabin itself, a temporary measure that would become permanent over the following days. Water buckets were filled from the well and lined against the interior wall where they would not freeze solid. The door was reinforced with boards they had prepared weeks ago, sealing gaps, blocking wind, creating a barrier between life and death. At 2:47, the first snowflakes fell. By 3 o'clock, visibility had dropped to 20 feet. By 3:30, visibility was 0. The sound came first, a roaring like nothing Elspeth had ever heard, like every freight train in the world arriving at once. Then the cabin began to shake. The walls groaned. The roof creaked. Snow found every crack and crevice, driving through gaps smaller than a fingernail, dusting the floor with white that immediately began to melt near the stove. Copper pressed himself against Elspeth's legs, shaking. "It's all right," she told him, though her own voice trembled. "We're ready. We're ready for this." The thermometer on the wall, visible through the window glass, read 12 degrees below 0. By morning, it would read 32 below. By Christmas Day, it would read numbers that Elspeth had never imagined possible. The first night lasted forever. The sisters took turns feeding the stove, keeping the fire burning hot and steady with wood from the underground chamber. Every 2 hours, one of them would dress in every piece of warm clothing they owned, descend the tunnel, and return with another load of fuel. The wood was dry, perfectly dry. It burned hot and clean, producing warmth without the smoke and spitting that plagued families, burning wet logs from outdoor piles. Outside, the world was dying. They could not see it happening, but they could imagine it. The cattle huddled against fences that provided no shelter, the horses standing frozen in barns with inadequate insulation, the woodpiles buried under drifts that made retrieval impossible. They could imagine families burning through their carefully stacked cords at twice the normal rate, wet wood producing half the heat while the cold demanded twice as much. The storm did not stop. December 24th, Christmas Eve. Negative 38 degrees. The snow was 4 feet deep and still falling. The wind had created drifts that reached second-story windows in town. Roads had vanished entirely. The world had become a white void where direction and distance meant nothing. Inside the Lindqvist cabin, the temperature held at 62 degrees. Rosalind read aloud from a book of poetry their grandmother had kept. Elspeth worked on translating pages from Astrid's journal, using a Swedish-English dictionary they had found among the old woman's possessions. Copper lay by the fire, occasionally lifting his head to listen to the wind, then settling back down with a sigh. The chickens clucked nervously in their corner. The stove burned steadily. The cabin held. December 25th, Christmas Day, negative 42 degrees. The sisters did not celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate except survival itself. And survival was not a celebration, but a constant vigilance. They measured wood consumption against estimated reserves. They measured heat against cold. They measured time against time. They were using 1/4 cord per day. At that rate, their 33 cords would last 132 days. More than 4 months. More than enough. But elsewhere in Carroll County, calculations were revealing uglier numbers. Marcus Holloway's family was burning a full cord every 2 days, their wet wood producing so little heat that they had to keep the stove blazing constantly. At that rate, their 20 cords would last 40 days. They had already been burning for 3. Reverend Whitmore had stopped preaching about pagan methods. He was too busy breaking apart pews to feed his church's stove, the wood he had purchased having run out on Christmas Eve. Margaret Dahl's husband had lost 3 fingers to frostbite, attempting to retrieve logs from their buried woodpile. He would never have full feeling in his remaining fingers again. Josiah Tanner's father died on Christmas Day. He had gone out to search for a cow that had broken through a fence, certain he could find her in the storm. The snow swallowed him whole. Josiah searched for 3 hours before his mother pulled him back inside, screaming that she would not lose her son the same day she lost her husband. They found the body 50 feet from the cabin when the snow melted in spring, frozen solid, his face turned toward home. The storm continued. December 26th, -40 degrees. December 27th, -38. December 28th. A brief warming to -28 that felt almost tropical. December 29th. Back to -41. The drifts were 8 feet deep in places. The wind had not stopped in 6 days. The county was paralyzed, cut off, dying by inches in a white hell that no one had prepared for because no one had believed it could happen. January 1st, 1855. The new year arrived in darkness. -47 degrees. A temperature so cold that water thrown into the air would freeze before hitting the ground. A temperature so cold that exposed skin would begin to freeze in 90 seconds. A temperature so cold that it killed simply by existing. The cabin Lindqvist remained at 62 degrees. Elsbeth had done the math. They were using fuel at a rate that would see them through until April, with cords to spare. The ventilation system worked perfectly, drawing fresh air through the chamber and keeping the stored wood dry. The drainage system worked perfectly, channeling any moisture away from the logs. Everything Astrid had taught them, everything they had built with bleeding hands and broken backs, was functioning exactly as designed. Outside, Carroll County was collapsing. They learned later that 23 people died that winter, 15 from exposure, 4 from starvation when supplies ran out, 2 from fires that started when desperate families tried to heat their homes with inadequate fuel and poor ventilation. 2 simply walked into the storm, elderly men who had decided that death was preferable to watching their families freeze. 400 cattle died, 300 horses, countless chickens, pigs, goats, and other livestock. 15 cabins collapsed entirely under the weight of accumulated snow. But inside the Lindqvist cabin, the fire burned steadily, the chickens clucked in their corner, and 2 young women who everyone expected to die first sat reading poetry and translating Swedish survival manuals. They were not just surviving, they were warm. The first knock came on January 10th. It came at 3 in the morning, barely audible over the wind. Copper heard it first, raising his head from his paws, ears pricked toward the door. Elsbeth was awake, maintaining the stove, and she paused with a log in her hands. The knock came again, louder, more desperate. She set down the log and crossed to the door. "Who's there?" A voice she recognized, though she had never heard it sound so broken. Please let us in." She opened the door to find Jasper Crane standing in 4 feet of snow, his face white with frost, his eyes wild with fear. Behind him, on a sledge that he had somehow dragged through impossible drifts, lay his wife, unconscious. 2 children huddled beside her, his grandchildren, she would learn later, visiting for the holidays when the storm trapped them. "Please," Crane said again, "we have nothing left. No wood, no heat. The house is freezing. I don't know what else to do. Please." Elsbeth stood in the doorway of the cabin he had tried to steal, looking at the man who had predicted her death, who had bought up all the wood in the county to force her into submission, who had ridden past every week counting the empty yard with satisfaction. Rosalind appeared behind her, saw who was at the door, and drew a sharp breath. Elsbeth was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Crane's eyes began to lose hope, long enough that Rosalind was not sure what her sister would do. Then Elsbeth stepped aside. "Come in, Mr. Crane, all of you." The man who wanted them dead was now inside their home, warming himself by their fire, drinking their water, wrapped in their blankets. What would you have done? Would you have opened that door? Elsbeth's answer that night revealed everything about who she truly was, and what happened over the next 7 days would change Carroll County forever. They carried his wife to the warmest spot in the cabin, near the stove. The children, a boy of 7 and a girl of 5, were barely conscious, hypothermic, their lips blue and their fingers white. Rosalind wrapped them in blankets while Elsbeth heated water for warm drinks that might save their lives. Crane stood in the center of the room, shaking so violently he could not speak. His clothes were soaked. His boots were frozen solid. He had walked 3 miles through waist-deep snow, dragging a sledge with his family, because there was nowhere else to go. "How?" he finally managed. "How are you?" Elsbeth handed him a cup of hot water with honey. "Drink first, questions later." He drank. He wept. He drank more. The children began to warm, color returning to their cheeks. movement returning to their fingers. His wife opened her eyes and looked around in confusion at a cabin she had never seen, surrounded by strangers who had saved her life. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." Elsbeth just nodded and returned to the stove. The others came over the following days. First, the Holloway family, Marcus, his wife, and their 4 children, their cabin roof having partially collapsed under snow weight. Marcus stood in the doorway, the man who had warned them about flooding and rot, his face gray with exhaustion and shame. "I told you it wouldn't work," he said quietly. "I told everyone in town you were wasting your time." Elsbeth looked at him for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in before your children freeze." Then Margaret Dahl and her husband, his bandaged hands useless, their own supplies exhausted. The woman who had spread rumors about grave digging stood silent in the warm cabin, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Then Reverend Whitmore, humbled and silent, his church now a frozen shell with no pews and no heat. The minister who had warned against pagan methods entered like a penitent, his Bible clutched to his chest. Then Dr. Samuel Prescott, who had stayed behind to help others until there was no one left to help and no warmth left to sustain him. The doctor who had warned about pneumonia and folk remedies stood in their cabin, his medical bag clutched to his chest, his face gray with exhaustion. "I treated frostbite for 3 weeks straight," he said quietly. "I amputated 14 fingers and 6 toes. I watched 4 people die because I could not keep them warm long enough to save them." He looked around the cabin, at the steady fire, at the comfortable temperature, at the people who were alive because of a hole in the ground. "I should have listened. When that Swedish woman talked about underground storage keeping wood dry, I dismissed it as superstition. I was trained in Philadelphia. I thought I knew better." He set down his bag. "I was wrong, and I intend to spend the rest of my career making sure other doctors understand what I learned too late." Then Josiah Tanner and his widowed mother, the boy who had painted those words on their chicken coop, arriving at their door with tears frozen to his cheeks. His father had died on Christmas Day, walking 50 feet into the storm searching for a lost cow. Josiah had found the tracks himself, leading nowhere. He stood in the doorway, 19 years old but looking like a child, his bravado stripped away by grief and cold, and the terrible weight of regret. "I painted those words on your coop," he said, his voice breaking. "I bet $5 you would fail. I laughed when others laughed. And now my father is dead, and you're the only ones who can save my mother." He dropped to his knees in the snow. "I'm sorry. God forgive me. I'm so sorry." Elsbeth looked at him for a long moment. She remembered the paint dripping down the wood. She remembered Rosalind's trembling hands as they scrubbed it clean. She remembered the laughter that had followed them through town. Then she reached down and pulled him to his feet. "Your father is gone. That is punishment enough." She stepped aside. "Come inside, both of you. We'll discuss the rest when you're warm." Temperance Garrett came last, on the 12th day of the storm, her father having finally admitted that they could not survive alone. She burst through the door with a grin that defied the cold. "I knew it," she said. "I knew you would be all right." The cabin held 17 people, 17 souls in a space designed for 2, sharing warmth and food and the impossible gift of survival. They slept in shifts. They ate in rationed portions. They told stories to pass the endless hours of darkness. And on the 3rd night of communal survival, Elsbeth took them all down to the cellar. She watched their faces as they descended the tunnel, as they emerged into the chamber, as they saw the rows of dry wood stretching toward the ceiling. 25 cords remaining, enough to last months. Marcus Holloway, the carpenter who had warned them about flooding and rot, walked the length of the chamber, running his hands over the timber reinforcements, examining the joints, testing the stability of the platforms that held the wood. "I have built 200 structures in my life," he finally said. "I told you this would flood. I told you it would rot. I told everyone in town that you were wasting your time." He turned to face Elsbeth, his weathered face struggling with emotion. "I was the expert, 20 years of experience, and I was completely, utterly wrong." He knelt down and examined the drainage stones, the slope of the floor, the ventilation shaft that kept air circulating. "This is better engineering than anything I've ever built above ground. You did this in 4 months with 2 pairs of hands, and it works better than barns I spent years constructing." He stood up and met her eyes. I'm sorry I doubted you. And I'm asking, when spring comes, will you teach me? Will you let me learn what you know? Elspeth nodded. That's all I ever wanted. Not for people to stop doubting, just for them to be willing to learn. Crane was standing in a corner, his face unreadable. Elsbeth approached him. You bought all the wood in the county, she said. You thought you could force us to sell. He nodded, unable to meet her eyes. Why didn't it work? His voice was barely audible. Because you had wood I didn't know about. Because I dug a hole in the ground and filled it with what I needed before you had the chance to take it away. She paused. Do you understand now? I understand that I was wrong. He looked up, finally meeting her gaze. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about everything. The storm broke on January 18th. 18 people emerged from the Lindqvist cabin into a world transformed. The snow lay 6 feet deep everywhere, 8 feet in drifts, creating a landscape of white hills and valleys that bore no resemblance to the farmland beneath. The sky was clear. The sun was blinding. The temperature had risen to 5 degrees below zero, which felt almost warm after what they had endured. They surveyed the damage in silence. 15 cabins destroyed. Countless animals dead. Roads buried. Fences gone. The infrastructure of survival wiped away as if it had never existed. But they were alive. All 17 of them. Plus 2 orphan girls who had saved them. Reverend Whitmore broke the silence. In my sermon last October, he said, I warned against pagan methods, against Swedish superstition, against trusting in human preparation rather than divine providence. He paused, his eyes moving across the devastated landscape. I was a fool. I was a proud, ignorant fool. He turned to Elspeth. I have spoken ill of you. I have questioned your faith and your methods. I have encouraged others to mock you. His voice cracked. I was wrong. Before God and all these witnesses, I was wrong, and I ask your forgiveness. Elspeth was quiet for a moment. Forgiveness is easy to give, she said finally. Understanding is harder. Can you understand why we did what we did? Why we dug in the darkness while you laughed? I think so. Yes. Then help us teach others. When spring comes, when people are ready to rebuild, help us show them what we learned. That is the forgiveness I want. Whitmore nodded slowly. I will. I swear before God, I will. Marcus Holloway stepped forward. I'll help too. I know how to build. I can help people build cellars like yours. Better maybe with proper carpentry. And I'll spread the word, Margaret Dahl said, and there was no trace of gossip in her voice now. I know how to make sure everyone hears a story. Let me tell this one. One by one, they offered their help, their skills, their willingness to learn and teach and pass on what the Lindqvist sisters had shown them. Josiah Tanner stepped forward last. The boy who had painted hatred on their walls stood straight now, his grief transformed into something harder and more useful. I'll build cellars, he said. I'll build them for every family who can't afford to dig their own. I'll work for free until I've built enough to make up for what I did. He met Elspeth's eyes. I can't bring my father back. I can't undo the words I painted on your coop, but I can make sure no one else dies the way he did. Elspeth nodded. That's a start. Jasper Crane was last. He stood apart from the group, his face troubled, his usual confidence nowhere to be seen. I have been buying homesteads for 27 years, he said. I've watched dozens of widows fail, dozens of families give up. I counted your woodpile from horseback every week, waiting for you to freeze. He paused, struggling with words that did not come easily. I never thought to look under my feet. He met Elspeth's eyes. What can I do? What can a man like me possibly do to make amends for what I intended? Elspeth studied him for a long moment. This man who had wanted to profit from her death. This man whose schemes had been defeated not by confrontation, but by simple preparation. This man who was asking, genuinely asking, how to become something other than what he had been. You have money, she said. You have influence. Use them to help people build instead of helping yourself acquire. Fund cellars for families who can't afford to dig their own. Pay for wood to be stored for widows and orphans who have no one to help them. She stepped closer. You wanted to own this county by waiting for people to fail. Now own it by helping them succeed. That's what you can do. Crane was silent for a long time. Then he nodded. I will, he said. I give you my word. What happened next surprised everyone who knew Jasper Crane. He kept his word. In the spring of 1855, he funded the construction of 12 underground storage cellars across Carroll County. He hired Marcus Holloway to supervise the work, paying fair wages to workers who had lost everything in the winter. He purchased wood at market prices and donated it to families who could not afford their own supplies. He never tried to buy the Lindqvist land again. The knowledge spread. By the summer of 1855, 34 families in Carroll County had built underground storage systems based on the Swedish method. By 1860, the number had grown to 47. The wetwood desperation of February 1855 became a memory that people told stories about but never repeated. The death toll from the following winter was 3, not 23. 3. Josiah Tanner became one of the most tireless advocates for the Lindqvist method, helping to build more underground cellars than anyone except Marcus Holloway himself. He never spoke of the graffiti again, but he named his first daughter Elsbeth. Dr. Samuel Prescott wrote a detailed report for the Eastern Medical Journals in 1859, describing what he called the Lindqvist method. The report drew attention from researchers who recognized that folk wisdom often contained scientific principles that formal education had overlooked. Elsbeth married Eric Magnusson in the spring of 1857, 3 years after his mother had died, leaving her the journal that contained 4 generations of survival knowledge. They built a larger cabin on the combined properties, expanded the underground storage to hold 50 cords, and raised 3 children who grew up knowing that the best way to prepare for winter was to go underground. Rosalind became a teacher. She established a school in Carroll County where children learned reading, writing, arithmetic, and practical survival skills that no Eastern curriculum would ever include. She married a doctor from Chicago in 1862, a man who had come west to study the indigenous medical practices of the frontier, and stayed because he fell in love with a woman who had taught herself to survive impossible odds. Copper, the golden-coated dog who had watched over Grandmother Martha, and then the sisters, died in 1867 at the age of 17. He was buried beside the grave of Grandmother Martha, next to the creek where wildflowers bloomed each spring. His headstone read simply, "He kept watch." Temperance Garrett became the first woman in Carroll County to build her own underground cellar without help. She was 19 years old when she completed it, working nights just as Elsbeth and Rosalind had done, defying expectations just as they had defied them. She went on to teach the method to dozens of other young women, creating a network of knowledge that spread across Iowa and into neighboring states. And what of Jasper Crane? He died in 1871, 16 years after the winter that changed him. His obituary in the county newspaper mentioned his business success, his many properties, his surviving children and grandchildren. But his will told a different story. Among the bequests was a sum of $2,000, an enormous amount for the time, designated for what he called the Lindqvist Fund. The money was to be used in perpetuity to help families in Carroll County build underground storage systems, with special priority given to widows and orphans. The final paragraph of the will was read aloud at the funeral, as Crane had instructed. "I spent 27 years taking land from those who could not survive. I believed I was practicing simple business. I believed the weak deserved to fail, and the strong deserved to profit from their failure. Elspeth Lindqvist taught me that survival is not about what you take. It is about what you give. It is about digging in darkness so that others might live in light. She taught me this by opening her door when she had every reason to leave me standing in the cold. I have spent the last 16 years trying to be worthy of that mercy. I do not know if I have succeeded, but I have tried. Let that be my epitaph. He tried to become what one woman's kindness showed him he could be." The cellar that Elspeth and Rosalind built in the summer of 1854 stood for 87 years. It finally collapsed in 1941. The timber rotted through, the earth reclaiming what had been taken from it. But by then, hundreds of similar structures had been built across Iowa, and the principle had spread far beyond the county where 2 orphan girls had first learned it from a Swedish grandmother who refused to let knowledge die with her. Elsbeth Lindqvist Magnusson died in 1901, 70 years old on the land she had refused to sell. She died in summer, peacefully, surrounded by children and grandchildren and the great-grandchildren she had lived long enough to hold. The obituary mentioned her family, her contributions to the community, her long life on the farm she had built with 2 husbands. It did not mention Jasper Crane, or the missing woodpile, or the 33 cords of perfectly dry wood that had kept 17 people alive when everyone expected her to freeze. But the people who knew the story kept telling it. They told it to their children, who told it to their children, who told it to generations that would never know Iowa winters, like the winter of 1854 to 55. The story of 2 orphan girls who dug a hole in the ground. The story of a cellar that no one could see. The story of a man who counted the empty yard and never thought to look beneath his feet. Some stories end with the hero defeating the villain in dramatic confrontation. This one ends with something quieter. A door opened in a blizzard. A choice made in darkness. A legacy passed from grandmother to granddaughter, to stranger, to community, to history. Elsbeth's great-granddaughter found Rosalind's journal in 1963, tucked in a trunk that had been sealed since the younger sister's death in 1928. The journal contained daily entries from the summer and winter of 1854, written in a cramped hand that grew steadier as the months progressed. The entry from January 10, 1855, the night Jasper Crane came to their door, read simply, "Elsbeth opened the door for the man who wanted us dead. I asked her why. She said, 'Rosie, we didn't dig that cellar to prove them wrong. We dug it to survive, and survival means nothing if you survive alone.'" The final entry, from the day the storm broke, contained 3 sentences that seemed to capture everything the sisters had learned in their impossible year. "We are alive. They are alive. That is enough. That is everything." What is the cellar you are digging right now? The preparation no one sees, the work no one understands, the knowledge you are storing against a winter that has not yet arrived? And when the storm comes, when the skeptics who laughed come knocking, will you have the courage to open your door? Think about it. Think about who in your life might need shelter that you could provide. Think about what you know that others might need to learn. And if this story of hidden preparation, of quiet strength, of doors open to those who least deserve mercy has meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Not because the teller asked, but because some stories are too important to keep to ourselves. That is what Astrid taught Elsbeth in a summer of digging. That is what Elsbeth taught 17 souls in a winter of survival. That is what we pass on now to you.